Well, hi. I'm Jesse Liberty. I'm the developer community evangelist on the Windows Phone team. Newly on the Windows Phone team, although I have been working with community for Microsoft for 4 years. Very excited about being on the Windows Phone team. Today, we're going to be discussing XAML programming for the phone. We will take a look at building a first application with XAML and some of what can be done with declarative programming. We will then move on to a critical new feature in the latest version of the phone, Mango, codename Mango, which is fast application switching. And we'll take a couple minutes to look at what it is you need to do in your program, whether your existing program or your new program, to make fast application switching work. And then in a third demo, we will take a look at what is perhaps the key to successful Windows Phone programming, which is data binding. The essence of my presentation is that between Visual Studio and Expression Blend, Windows Phone developers have, hands down, in my opinion, the best development environment for mobile application development and for building spectacular phone applications. The main focus of this discussion will be to provide a good grounding in XAML programming. We will begin at the beginning of XAML programming and progress fairly quickly in this overview to more advanced topics with an idea, as I say, of providing a solid foundation. In that spirit, 99% of our time will be spent in demos, not in PowerPoint. That's usually a resounding applause line, but that's, there you go. No PowerPoint. When you have to ask for it, you're dead already. Okay, what I'm going to do is start in Visual Studio and create a new Windows Phone application. So if I say New Project, and I choose Silverlight for Windows Phone, you'll see that there are a number of different templates that I can use, and these are designed to make programming Windows Phone applications a little bit easier, to give you a starting point of code that you can then modify or adjust to your own needs. So we have data-bound applications, and we have panorama and pivot applications, audio playback and streaming, and so forth. We're going to start off with a very simple Windows Phone application. Let's call this calculator, because what I wish to build is a very simple 4-function calculator. And we're not even going to complete that, but we'll get an idea of what's involved. And when I say OK, the first thing that I'm asked is, what's my target platform? And my choices are Windows Phone 7, which is what has been in the marketplace, and Windows Phone 7.1, codename Mango, which is the forthcoming version for which you can get the developer tools right now. We're going to build to Mango. And as soon as Visual Studio settles down, you'll see that my main window is divided into two areas, the design window and the XAML area. And over on the right is a properties window, which is context sensitive. So if I click, for example, on the page name, let's pin the properties window, then it goes to the, this is actually called the page title. It will go to the page title properties, and I can set any number of properties. What's key here is that I can code, if I choose to, directly in the XAML. So for example, I can edit the text. Let's bump that text. Actually, I don't think you can bump the text up in this window, but we're not going to stay in this window for long. If I come to the text that says page name and I change it to hello in the XAML, you see that it's immediately reflected in the designer and also in the properties window. Everything we're going to do for the next hour could be done directly in the XAML. Now, I have a friend who says you can have an appendectomy through your throat, it just takes longer and hurts more. You can write everything by hand in XAML. And certainly you want to be in a position where you can read the XAML, and XAML is eminently readable. But there are tools that make working with XAML far easier, and those tools are now so efficient that the XAML that they produce is no more bloated, no more additional overhead and cruft than you would put into your own XAML. It's very lean and it's very clean when you use the tools. Many of us have evolved a style that says that we do our logic programming, our C# programming in Visual Studio, and we do our design and interacting with controls and data binding all in Expression Blend. Expression Blend uses precisely the same files as Visual Studio. There's no translation between them. They use identical files. And so you can open up your solution or your project in Blend and Visual Studio at the same time and move freely back and forth. So let's open this in Blend by right-clicking on the project and saying Open in Expression Blend. It asks me to save the changes I've made. It opens up Expression Blend 4. I'm working with Expression Blend 4. Those of you who have slates, which is everybody in this room except me, I think, have Expression Blend 5, or at least a prototype of Expression Blend 5 for Windows 8. But this is Blend 4. This is available now for use with Windows Phone programming. Let me use my mouse wheel to size that a bit. The first thing I'm going to do is take the page title and delete that. The second thing I'm going to do is to click on the title for the application, and over in the Properties window, and let me ask you this just by a quick show of hands. Down here I have the text. Please raise your hand if you cannot easily see that. Almost all of you can see that. I will use a little bit of the magnifier for some key things, but if you're far enough back that you're not seeing that, I really do urge you to move forward. I don't want you to miss some of what we're going to be doing in Blend. And the less I use the magnifier, the less I'll make some folks seasick. So if we come over to the title and we drop down to the Properties window, in the Properties window, this is a text block, and so it has a text property, and we can change that to Calculator. And when I tab out, that's now appearing in the Design window. Once again, everything we're doing is also being done in XAML, and we can see that by going to the Split view, and here's that text block, and the text has been set to Calculator. I'm not going to keep going back and forth between the Design view and the XAML view. Just note that everything we're doing in the Design view is generating legitimate and terse XAML. All right, let's move a couple light years ahead. The second panel that's in this main grid, and we can tell what's in this main grid by looking over at the Objects and Timeline, and we see that we've got a phone application page. Within that, we have an application bar and the layout root. Layout root is the grid which represents the topmost portion of our UI. Within that is a title panel and a content panel. I'm going to drag a button from the toolbar, which is over here on the left. I'm going to click on button and drag a button into the content panel. And then I'm going to hit F5, which starts up the emulator. Now, the first time that you start the emulator, it is a little bit slow to get going. We're starting up essentially a virtual machine. So you'll find that Windows Phone developers are going to keep that emulator running as they do their changes and their debugging. So we're going to let this start up. When I click on the button, the default behavior when I click on the button is for the background to be white. So if I hold my mouse button down, you can see the background is white. I would like to modify that. And that leads me to a very key point about Windows Phone programming. Every single control that you take out of the text, out of the toolbar, forgive me, just totally blanked the word. Every single control that you take out of the toolbar or that you add from any source is inherently lookless. Lookless. There's no official look for that control. The look is determined by styles and templates. Of course, every control comes with a set of styles and templates so that you don't have to write it yourself. But you are free to override that, make a copy and modify it, or replace it altogether. We're going to modify this slightly. The way we'll do that is to exit the application, return to Expression Blend, and I'm going to right-click on the button, and let's add a little magnification for those of you who are having trouble seeing. I'm going to right-click on the button, and I'm going to choose Edit Template, Edit a Copy. This puts me into the template editor, and it asks me to name the style I'm creating. Let's call that Accent Button Style. And my second choice here is, do I want this to be only for this document that is only usable by this page, or for the entire application? I'll say the entire application. I'm now in the template editor. There's a number of ways to tell that. There are breadcrumbs, and over here it says return scope to the page, so I'm well within the template editor. I can do a number of things with this button. Remember that I'm editing a copy. One of the advantages of editing a copy is all of the parts of the original button are there, as well as a key feature which is called view states. View states say, under this viewing condition, here's what I want you to do, Mr. Control. Well, the button comes with a number of view states. Let's open that up a little bit. It has two groups of view states. It has the focus states for what happens when the button is unfocused or has the focus. And then it has what are called the common states for what happens under normal conditions, mouse over, and pressed and disabled. Notice pressed is that white background. That's what we want to modify. When you click on one of these states, you begin recording. So I'm going to go to the press state, open up the button background, find the background property, come over to the common properties for that brush, and choose a system resource, which is the phone accent brush. On the phone, the user can set the accent color. They can have their default accent colors for what tiles look like and so on be red or blue or green, whatever it is. I would like my button, when you press it, to pick up that accent color. So I'm just going to ask it to use that brush. Let's just double check that when we're in the other states, we don't have that. When we're pressed, we do. And notice it's pale blue. I'm going to stop recording, pop out of editing my template, and run this application by hitting F5. Now you'll notice that my accent color went by fairly quickly, is bright orange. When I click the button, that's the color that it picks up. Not the pale blue that it showed me when I was designing, but because I'm using the accent color brush, whatever is the accent color for this user. If I were to change this user's accent color, the background would change. Very quickly, let's return to the design surface and take another button and drag it on. I certainly could, at this point, do exactly the same work. Instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is right-click, say Edit Template, and instead of saying Edit a Copy, I'm going to say Apply a Resource, and there's that resource we just created, Accent Button Style. I'm just going to apply that to the button. Having applied that resource to that button, it gets exactly the same functionality in its view state. Now what I really want here is not two buttons, but all the buttons for a calculator. Rather than making you sit through my creating that, let's go to a project that I've created that is partially implemented. So we'll open project, go to calculator app. And what I've done here, the only change that I've made here is I've put in all of the buttons for my calculator, and I've put in a couple grids which I will show you. If I run this application, and let's go ahead and close Visual Studio so as to avoid confusion. If I run this application, then you'll see that all of these buttons have that style. Now, my boss came along and took a look at that and said, yeah, that looks pretty good, but they're not making any noise when I click on them. I'd really like the feedback of a little bit of noise. Fortunately, I don't have to add sound to every one of the buttons. Remember, all the buttons are sharing a style. I can take advantage of that. Let's take a quick look at how that's done. I'll come over to my projects window. I don't yet have a folder for sound, but I do have a sound file that I found. So let's add a folder. We'll call it Sounds. And then I'll right-click on that folder and tell it that what I'd like it to do is add an existing item, and I'll navigate to where I put those sounds. And here's a tiny button push sound. That's now in my project. It's not attached to any of the buttons, but it is in my project. Now, I can certainly write code in C# that will take each button's click event handler and play that sound. But Blend has a concept that was created for designers and is a brilliant and wonderful innovation for programmers called behaviors. Behaviors are a way to declare in XAML the behavior that you want attached to various events. For example, I can go over to Assets and choose Behaviors. Let me magnify that for you so you can see some of them. There are a number of pre-existing behaviors, one of which is Play Sound Action. All I need to do is click on Play Sound Action and drag that down to my buttons template. Let's get into the button template by right-clicking on the button and saying Edit Template, edit the current template. Now I take my Play Sound Action, drag it down onto the button's grid, which is the outermost part of the button. And over here in the properties, it says, well, what event do you want that tied to? I'm going to use mouse left button down. I don't have a click event because I'm in part of a button, not a button itself. I'm in the grid for the button. It says, what's your source of the sound? Well, we've added a sound file to this project, so it finds it right away. And then I can adjust the volume. Let's just adjust that all the way up to 1. Pop out of my template editor and run the application. And what I've now done is I've attached that play sound behavior to the template for the button. Every time I click on a button, I'm now going to get the click sound for that button. So that was extraordinarily easy, and so far I have not written any C#. Let's take a look at a couple other things we might want to do. I have 3 buttons down here, Steel, Flowers, and Bubbles. What I want them to do is to set the background. In order to do that, I need 2 pieces. I need the background itself, and then I need some code to go with it, some logic to explain how, when I click that button, that background is going to display. Let's take a look first at how we're going to create the background. We're going to do that by adding grids to this control. So behind these buttons, I have added 3 grids. I call them Still Grid, Flowers Grid, and Bubbles Grid. Very original titling. I also, in my project, have some images. So if you look at the Bubbles background, the Flowers background, and the Steel background, those are the images that I want associated with those grids. The logic of what I'm going to do is to associate each of these with one of the grids, but have them not be visible until I turn them on by clicking the button. To do that, I'll go to the Steel grid and come over to its properties and say that its image source is the Steel image, but its visibility, instead of being visible, is collapsed. When you make it collapsed, you not only make it invisible, but you take it out of the image hierarchy. So it doesn't take up any space or memory. I will do the same thing with the Flowers grid. Come over to the Flowers grid and say that I would like the Flowers grid to be put in place and collapsed, and on the bubbles grid, I would like the bubbles grid to be in place but collapsed. So my 3 grids are now in place. I can see over in my properties window that they have the right images, but they're all collapsed. Once again, I could easily write code to click on the button event handler and make them visible. But I can also take advantage of view state. View state says, under this view, when this happens, either the mouse hovers over me or some other condition in the view, this is what I want to have happen. And that can involve animations, and it can involve a great deal of complexity. I'm going to create some view states that will correspond to displaying that background. To do that, I'm going to go to the states window and notice that there aren't any view states at the moment, so I'm going to add a state group called background states. And then inside background states, I'm going to add 3 view states. The first view state I'm going to call steel state. I suspect you're ahead of me on the others. The second one I'm going to call flowers state, and the third one I'm going to call bubbles state. Let's go to steel state. Notice recording is on. What change do I want to make when I enter steel state is that I want the steel grid to switch from collapsed to visible. Similarly, when I enter flowers state, I want the flowers grid to switch from collapsed to visible. And when I enter bubble state, I want the bubbles grid to switch from collapsed to visible. So I now have my 3 states. Terrific. Once again, I can write code from the button to switch to that state. The Visual State Manager is an object. I can say, Visual State Manager, go to state, and tell it what state I want to go to. Perfectly legitimate. But I can also do this declaratively by going back to those very powerful behaviors. If I come back to my assets and my behaviors, one of the behaviors is go to state action. If I drag go to state action onto the steel button, over in the properties it says, well, what's the event name? And it defaults to click. Of course, it could be any of the events that a button supports, but click is just what I want. What state do you want to go to? And it knows what states I have, so I want to go to the steel state. I'll do the same thing, go to state action to flowers, and say, please go to the flower state, go to state action to bubbles, please go to the bubbles state. And when I run my application, now I've not written any C#, every bit of this has been declarative in XAML. As I click the steel button, the flowers button, and the bubbles button, you can see that the state is being switched and the state is causing an action to occur. If we look at the XAML that was created, you can find in here in a very readable, and the thing about XAML is that it's both human readable and highly machine readable. And that is one of the most powerful aspects of XAML, is that it is so machine readable that both Visual Studio and Expression Blend can read that. And XAML, by the way, stands for Extensible Application Markup Language, and we're seeing that extensibility in its use in Windows 8 and in Windows Phone for that matter, because when XAML was first being used, it was being used in WPF and then in Silverlight, now in the phone, and also it's being used in Windows 8. So we can see in here, if we look very quickly, we can see that there's a declarative trigger here for playing the sound. We can see that there are storyboards, which are really animations for transitioning from one state to another. Everything that we have just created is declared in the XAML. So this is very highly functional programming, non-procedural. We're not using C# so far. Okay, let's leave the calculator application and move on to some more advanced topics. And talk about fast application switching. Fast application switching is a response to the fact that when the phone first came out, if you moved from application A to application B, you saw a change to the new application. When you went back to application A, you got a screen that said resuming. A goal in Mango was to avoid that, to be able to move from one application to the other very quickly. In order to understand how to implement that, we need to take just a couple minutes and talk about the various states that your application might enter, what we call the application lifecycle. When your application begins, an event called application launching is fired. The first page in your phone application comes up, and its onNavigated-to method is invoked. At the conclusion of that method, your application is running. There are a number of ways that you might leave that application. You might close the application, you might go to another application, you might follow toast or a notification, and so on. If you leave the application to go to another application, what actually happens is that you have an application deactivated event fire, and your page receives a call to its onNavigated-from method. So as you leave the page, onNavigated-from is called. As you come to the page, onNavigated-to is called. That's true with every page, and we're going to take advantage of that. Now in Mango, rather than going to the tombstone state, you now go into what is called the dormant state. And what's wonderful about the dormant state is that all of your state is maintained. All of whatever is in your controls, whatever is on the page, is all maintained for you. If it were true that you would go from running to dormant and back to running, there would be nothing to do, and life would be particularly easy. However, if a lot of applications go into the dormant state, if memory is short, it is possible for your application to transition to the tombstone state. And there, unfortunately, the state of your page is lost unless you have saved it programmatically. When you come back from dormant or tombstoned, onNavigated-to is called, and application activated is fired. When you boil this down, the logic that gives you the best performance is to, on the transition from running to dormant, to save the state of your application, which you can do in a state dictionary, and I will show you that it's very straightforward. When you are returning from either dormant or tombstone, when you get that onNavigated-to method, now you have a choice to make. If you're returning from the dormant state, you don't want to do anything. You want to return instantly so that you get that fast application switching experience. But if you're returning from tombstone, then you do, in fact, want to restore the state. There's a small overhead in retrieving that data out of the state dictionary, but of course that's worth it because you want the user to experience that they're returning to the application in the way that they left it. When the application is completed, you get an onNavigated-from and an application closing. But the key piece that we care about is moving from the running state into the dormant state, and then being careful about what happens if you're moved into the tombstone state. Let's take a quick look at how you might implement that. And what I'm going to do is close the application we've been working on, open up Visual Studio, and because this is fairly straightforward, I've actually already created the application. We can just take a look at the code rather than attempting to recreate the code from scratch, because this is pretty straightforward material. What we're going to do is, first of all, we're going to have an object. Let me bump this up so you can see it a little bit better. We're going to have an object called the view model, and you'll be hearing a lot about model view, view model. For today, all we care about is that this is the state of your application. So we have an object, and it maintains the state of your application. We also have a flag, a Boolean, called isNewPageInstance, which we initialize to false. And basically, the job of this flag is to say, is this a new instance of the page or not? Now, here's the secret, which I'll give away right away. If you come here for the first time, or you come here from being tombstoned, your constructor will be called, and this flag will be set to true. If, however, you come back here from the dormant state, your constructor will not be called, and because this was initialized to false, it will be false. Therefore, true indicates that you do not yet have any state, and you might want to restore the state. False indicates don't do anything. Now, you remember on the way out, on navigated from, you need to stash away your state because you can't know whether you're going to come back from dormant or from tombstoned. So we have logic here that says put into the state dictionary under a key, and you can make up any name you like for that key, and put into that any serializable object. In my case, it's my view model. Let's take a really quick look for those of you who want to see the details of what that's involved, at what that object looks like. In order for that object to be serializable, that is to be stored in the dictionary, I've marked the class as a data contract. I've marked my public variables with data member. That's really the only work that I have to do to make that storable. Going back to where I was in my on-navigated from, you could imagine this without the if statement. I would just store it. The if statement is simply saying one thing. It's saying, look at system Windows navigation mode back, which is a very long name to simply say, did I get here by the user clicking the back key? If I got here by the user clicking the back key, the user's exiting the application. And if they're exiting the application, there's no reason for me to store state. And so I won't bother. Otherwise, I'm going to store state. I can't say, are they going to come back from dormant? Are they going to come back from tombstone? Because I can't know at this point. However, on navigated to, which is what's called when I come to the page, now I can know. And the very first thing I do is I check, is this a new page instance, which you'll remember will be false if I'm coming here from dormant. If it's false, I fall through that if statement, I do nothing, and I return. If it's true, then I got here either by coming from a tombstone state, or I got here as a new instance. And so I'm going to check, the first thing I'm going to check is my VM null? If it's not null, I have nothing to do. I have a perfectly valid VM. Presumably that will be null. The next thing I want to check is, have I stored it away in state? And so I ask the state dictionary, do you contain the key that I keep my main page view model in? If the answer to that is yes, then I do a restore. And because what I get back is an object, I do a cast. This as main page view model is a cast. And if I were very careful, I would then check to make sure I didn't get back null. I've added a message box here to indicate, yes, you're taking the time now to go get something from the state manager. Let's run the application very quickly. Okay, we have two pieces of information we're storing. I'm going to click in the text box, and up comes the soft interface panel, the on-screen keyboard. While typing this using your mouse is always entertaining, what I'm going to do is tell it I have an external keyboard, which when you're doing that on your laptop is by hitting the break key. Which is interesting because on my brand new laptop, on which I have practiced this about 20 times, I don't have a break key. And that'll teach you always to practice on the laptop you're actually using. I'm sorry. Page up. You're a good man. How about function page up? There we go. Okay, thank you very much for rescuing me. Give that man a free slate. We can cut that from the video, right? Good. All right, so I have my state here. If I go to another application by clicking the Start button and then choosing, for example, Internet Explorer, and then I back out of Internet Explorer and back into my application, notice my state is preserved. And that message box did not pop up. So I was in the dormant state. And I got that fast application switching. I did not see a screen that said resuming. I did not see my message box. I came right back. Now, if you're building this, the very first question that's going to occur to you is, well, how do I know what's going to happen when it's Tombstone? How do I recreate that? The answer to that question is to come back to your application, right-click on your project, choose Properties, and in the Debug tab, there is a check mark that says Tombstone upon deactivation while debugging. And what that does is it forces your application into the Tombstone state when it would otherwise go into the dormant state. I'm going to run the application again. Once again, type in some state. Once again, I'm going to exit to go into Explorer. Then back out of Explorer, go back to my application, and this time notice the pause, and there's my message box. Because I'm returning from Tombstone, it had to run through that logic. Those of you who have already WinPhone 7 applications, that is to say non-Mango applications, the preparation for switching over and taking advantage of fast application switching is either to do what I just did, or there is a flag that you can put into your activated and deactivated in your app.xaml file, which I've written up on my website and I can refer you to at the end of this talk. Either way will work, but the bottom line is you want to make sure you know if you're coming back from a dormant state so you can take advantage of fast application switching. Let's talk about data binding. Virtually every meaningful Windows Phone application is going to have some level of data. Data binding is the process by which you bind some piece of data to some control. Some on-screen visible control is the typical form of data binding. There are variations on this where we bind one control's data to another and so forth. But the key here is I'm going to display some data. I don't know at compile time what that data is. I know what it looks like. I know the shape of the data. I know the names of the properties, but I don't know the specific data until runtime. And so I want to bind that rather than hand-filling each of those controls, which is much more cumbersome, much more verbose, much harder to maintain. I want to use data binding, which is a much cleaner way to do that. To see that, let's close this application and open up a modification of one of the quick starts, which is the golf application. Let's take a look at, first of all, what this looks like when it's actually running. So, sorry, thank you very much. It worked perfectly on my screen. All right, I'm going to go to the completed version so you can see what this is going to look like when we're done, and run that. Is there a polite way to drink water while you're presenting? Well, not. Well done. I knew there was a reason we had David here. Absolutely, thank you. Okay. What we're going to have is search for a course. That's going to bring us to this pivot control. A pivot control allows you to take data and show it in multiple ways. A classic use of a pivot control would be when you have filtered data and unfiltered data, and here we have that. We have recent courses and all the courses. Notice that under recent courses, let me blow that up a little bit for you. Oh, that was excellent. Notice that under recent courses, we have the course name, the address, the date at which we played that course, and a rating of the course. And I can flick from recent to all and back. That's what we want to build. Let's close the current solution and back up an iteration. What I want to show you in Visual Studio, first off, is that this application has some sample data to work with at design time, as well as its real data to work with at runtime. That sample data is in a sample data folder. And if I open up that sample data folder, I've got XAML. So once again, we're using XAML here in a declarative way for our sample data. Let me collapse all of this. And then open this up. You'll see that there are sets of these. All players, all courses, friends, groups, recent courses. If I open up recent courses, I've got the various recent courses that we've played. Each one has an address, an ID, a name, the URL to a picture, the date we played, the rating as an integer, and possibly additional information such as phone number, website, and so on. That's all in straightforward XAML. I show that to you here because I'm now going to switch over to Blend, which is going to make that data much easier to work with, but it's still using this data. So let's open this application up using expression blend. And what I want to do as soon as I'm in this project is go to that same page. And notice we're starting out with nothing bound, no data whatsoever. What I do have on the left-hand side here is my layout. My layout root consists of a pivot control. That pivot control consists of two pivot items. The first pivot item has a grid in it which has a list box, the recent course list box. So when I click over here, what I'm clicking on is a list box. The first thing that I want to do, so that we don't have any mystery here, is I'm going to change the color of the foreground brush for what goes into the list box, because it's currently set to white, and you can see the background is white, and white on white makes seeing the data a little difficult. So I'm going to go ahead and set the foreground brush to blue. Now, what I want to do is I want to teach this how to take the data I have and display that data. What I'm going to do is take my data and hand it, my collection of courses, hand it to this list box and say, this is your item source. This is where you get all your items. But I also want to say to it, because it has no idea how to display a golf course, I want to say to it, I'm going to show you how to display each course in turn. One thing that I can do in Blend is go over to my data, find my recent courses, drag them over onto the list box, and you can see it says data bind recent courses list box.item source to recent courses. That is to say, do you want to take the recent courses data and make that the item source for this list box? And I do. And what it's going to do is its very best to take all of that data and stick it into a list box, which you can see it does. It's ugly as sin, but it does. It takes all the data and just drops it into that list box. This is clearly not a finished product, but it's a heck of a start. What we're going to do is identify a couple pieces of this data. The way we're going to do that is to come to the list box and right-click. Let me once again magnify for you. Right-click and say Edit Additional Templates, Edit Generated Items. We just generated the item template. And go ahead and edit the current one, the one that was just created for us. What we can see as soon as we do that is it consists of a stack panel with a bunch of text blocks in it. The first text block is the address. So let's go ahead and change its property to have a name, and we'll say that's the address. The fourth text block is the name of the course. So we'll call that course name. The rest of this does not display very well as text. It doesn't help me to have the URL to an image to display. So I'm going to get rid of all of the rest of these text blocks by shift-clicking, marking them all for deletion, but then control-clicking on address and control-clicking on course name and hitting delete. I now have a stack panel with just those two pieces. I actually don't want this to be a stack panel. I want it to be a grid. I'm going to right-click on the stack panel and say change layout type to grid. Now I have a grid with those two in it. Let's go to the course name. I would like this to display a little bit more nicely, so I'm going to go over to the foreground color and choose a local resource which is header brush. And I'm going to set its size to 24. Okay, that looks a little bit nicer. Let's align it left and top and say that we're going to indent that 84 from the left. However, the grid is not big enough, so let's go over to the grid and set its properties. Its width is going to be automatic, and its height is going to be 105. And these are values, obviously, I worked out in advance. Okay, we can now see the course name. Let's go over to the address, change the address property over to a local resource, which will be subhead brush, and we want to line that up. So we're going to say left top, left margin 84, and we'll make it 33 from the top. And you can see already that that's beginning to look a little bit better. Come over to our grid. I'd like to add an image. You'll remember that our data has a picture for every one of the courses. If you looked at that XAML, we had the URL to an image. I'd like to show that image. I don't have an image control showing in my toolbar, so I'll click on the chevron which says Assets and search for image. There's my image control. Let's add that to the toolbar. I added the wrong one, didn't I? Is that image control? That's a progress bar. Why are you giving me a hard time? There's my image bar. Okay. I'm going to double click on the image. That puts it right into my grid. Let's set that image to be 64 by 64. Left aligned and top aligned, and we'll give it a margin of 5 from the left. That looks great. However, there's no image in the image. And this is where data binding is going to come in. We're already data binding the name of the course and the address. That was done for us simply by dragging it onto the form. We're now going to say, I also want you to data bind the image. So while the image is current, I'm going to go to the source for the image and click on the advanced options. That brings up this submenu, and I'll choose data binding. And that brings up my data context dialog box. It knows what all of the properties are of this data and how they might map to be the source for my image. I'm going to choose picture, and when I do, it says, okay, what you're telling me is in the item template, we should put the image associated with each item here. And you can see it immediately fills in all of the courses. We've got two more that I want to look at that take you slightly more advanced. If we go look at the data for recent courses, we see the name, we see the address, we see the image. We also see recent date. And if you look closely at recent date, you'll see that its type is nullable date time. That is to say, first of all, it's a date time, and secondly, it could be null. I want to display that in a text block, but there's no way to drop a nullable datetime into a text block and get something useful or meaningful. And in fact, I want to have control over what that looks like. I want it to look like a short datetime. That is, for today, I wanted to say, what's today's date? 11/16. That's not correct. Is that correct? 11/19/11? Whatever it is, I want the short datetime. Gives you some idea of how much time I've been spending in my room going over this, that I don't know what month it is. In order to do that, I need a data converter. A data converter is just a bit of C# that does that data conversion for me. If I go to project, I have a converters folder, and in there I have a short date converter. Let's go look at that in Visual Studio. Since it's C#, I tend to do that work in Visual Studio. Bump that up to 150%. The key thing about a data converter is that it inherits from I-value converter. And you can see that this is really very straightforward. I'm taking my value that's being passed in and converting it to a nullable datetime. If I don't get back null, that is, I have valid data, then I check to see if it has a value, and if it does, I call toShortDateString, and I return that short date string. This is all done in C#. How do I get that C# to run against the text block that I want to put into Blend? So let's come down to Blend and grab a text block and drop that into my grid. Let's go back to the Properties window for that text block. Tell it that I want to set the background color on that text block to the local resource light subheader. We'll come down and say left aligned, bottom aligned, 89 to make it line up, and we'll make it 20 from the bottom. Now my text block is there. However, it says text block. It doesn't say the date. I need to bind the text. Once again, I hit Advanced Options, Data Binding, go find the date, and that would be fine except that I need that converter to run. Down here, towards the bottom of the dialog box, is a little arrow. When I hover on it, it says Show Advanced Properties. And when I do that, I see the value converters. My value converter is not yet in that list of value converters, but if I click the ellipses, it will go through my entire project and find everything that implements I-value converter. So it does find short date converter. I'll click that, click OK. Bring my dialog box up enough. Interesting that I can't get to the bottom of the dialog box. So let's hide the toolbar window. It's here somewhere. Forget it. We'll just drag it out of the way. OK. Click OK. And now you can see that the date is being displayed properly because in that data binding, I'm also binding to the value converter. Now, the value converter was written in C#, but the binding was done entirely in XAML. And if we go to the XAML file, we can see every bit of this lined up in XAML. Let's take a fast look at one more piece of this. We have over in the Images folder a number of images with stars in them, rating 1, rating 2, rating 3, and I think you can see that they have the appropriate number of stars. We also have over in the data window, we have a rating which is an int 32. What I'm going to do is come to my grid, add another image. On that image, I'm going to say that I want your width to be 100 and your height to be 25. You're going to be lined left, bottom. We're going to say 339, so you're way over to the right, and 20, so that you're lined up on the bottom. And now my image is sitting there. And once again, I want to bind it. Once again, I have a converter, rating to image converter, Rating to image converter is again C# that knows how to take an integer and create a URL out of it for the right JPEG file. The way I hook those up is I come to the source and click on source and say data binding, but now I have a problem because rating isn't even in this list. Because Expression Blend does not recognize int32 as a potential source for my image. And that's because I have right here show matching types only. If I change that to show all properties, then I get every single property of that object, and I can choose rating. I can go to advanced properties, and I can click the ellipses and say rating to image converter, say OK, and there we have the rating showing. We have two, thank you. We have two pivots here. We have the pivot item for the recent and for all courses. Let's blisteringly quickly come over to all courses, open up its pivot item, open up its grid, double click on all list box. Over in my data, I have data for all the courses. That's up here. That was also XAML. I can drop that in. Now this is white on white so we don't see anything. I can do all the work I just did. That would be crazy. What I can do instead is I can right click on there and say edit additional templates, edit generated items item template, and instead of saying edit the current, go down to apply resources, grab that course template we just created, and apply it to all the courses. And now it fits on that second pivot as well. So we can reuse these styles and these controls that were created. I highly recommend that you look through your session guides and look at some of the other phone sessions that will be available today and also will be available on video. Before you leave, a couple resources for you. I've created a couple short URLs for the phone developer blog, which is wpdev.ms/wpdevblog, and for the phone material on MSDN. Everything I covered today, I will be covering in a series of mini tutorials. I currently have 110 mini tutorials on my website, and these will become mini tutorials and videos as well, and that's at jesseliberty.com. I really cannot thank you enough. You've been incredibly patient and friendly, and I thank you so much. Please be sure to grab one of these if you're interested in half off on an A-Press ebook. These are good for another 24 hours or so. If you don't see them in the back, they're up here as well. And thank you again.